Hi and welcome to the third podcast of KV421. This podcast looks particularly at some key terms in relation to working with children and young people, looks to explain what we might mean by those terms and helps you to think about how then they relate to your practice. As always, this is going out a week ahead of our next Saturday session, and we'll be picking up these themes on the whole group sessions and the reflective practice tutor group sessions on the Saturday morning. So the idea of being professional, which is at the heart of all the degree programmes on the Working with Children and Young People programme that we offer here at Brighton Uni, the heart of being professional embodies some aspect of commitment to doing good for the public. If you go back into history, back over time, and look at what it means to be a professional, that theme of doing good, contributing to the welfare and the well-being of society, is at the heart of what it means to be professional. And so we're framing today's session in terms of looking at issues of equality, inclusion and diversity in the context of contributing to doing good in society. And the way that those of us that work with children and young people have different professional values and different professional identity frames the way and gives direction to the way that we consider those issues of equality, inclusion and diversity. In other words, who you are as a professional directs your professional gaze in terms of those issues. But one of the things we want to do in this session is look at what those issues mean, and in particular how different approaches to working with children and young people from those professional values gives rise to different type of practices. In other words, how do we promote equality, inclusion and diversity? What does that mean in practice? Okay, and the final bit I want to kind of put in place before we kind of start looking at a particular model is to say that this commitment to equality and social justice, thinking about the way that society is ordered and is managed and is structured, those notions of equality and social justice from an educational point of view, we believe run right the way through our work with children and young people, right from 0 through to 19, early 20s and so on. So this sense of being committed to equality and social justice is one of the fundamental cornerstones of our practice. So let's think a bit more then about those terms, equality and inclusion and diversity. They are terms that often appear side by side, but also they're terms that the meaning changes over time. And what we meant by equality perhaps 50 years ago, perhaps 30 years ago, perhaps even 10 years ago, is different or could be different to how we see those ideas now. But the sense that those terms are used in different ways is something that we need to kind of explore and ensure that we are using those words to mean exactly what we want them to mean. And also be mindful that they are used by other people in different contexts. And one of the things we might look at then is the way that organisations that we work with have policy statements in relation to equality, inclusion and diversity. In other words, make statements about how the organisations we work for, whether it be a nursery, a school, a university, a youth group or whatever, how those organisations regard those issues and then direct us as practitioners to work to promote equality, diversity, inclusion and so on. I think another way of putting it is those terms are slippery. So if, for instance, I was writing an essay about equality or inclusion, I think it would be important to say how I'm using that word and to define it with reference to perhaps other authors or research or policy and so on. It's not good enough then to just simply say, I believe in equality without saying what you mean by equality. I want to then talk about 4 different approaches to equality, inclusion and diversity. And as I go through these 4, have a think about how they relate to your own approach, your own practice, and that of the employer with whom you work. In other words, how does your school or nursery or youth project or whatever it might be, how does that approach the issue of equality, inclusion and diversity? And therefore, what does that mean then in terms of your practice? So the first of those four approaches I'd refer to as welcome all. And what a welcome all approach says basically is that we welcome all people to come into our club, our nursery, our school, or whatever it might be. We don't discriminate against anyone at all. We recognise that our school, our college, our nursery, our youth group, whatever it might be, is open to everyone. And in one respect, that's a very, that kind of open door policy gives a message, rightly so, that schools, colleges, youth groups, nurseries, whatever they might be, are open to everyone. However, what it doesn't do, perhaps, is recognise that a particular dominant culture or a particular way of seeing the world or a particular way of doing things might unconsciously make it difficult for some people to join in or for some people to feel welcome. But that notion of an open door, welcome all policy is one that many projects, many schools, many colleges, many youth groups still pursue. And at one level, it does give a very positive message about broadly speaking, having an approach which is inclusive. So that's the first one, we call the welcome all or open door approach. The second approach I want to talk about is one that perhaps is best described as celebrating diversity. Now, a celebrating diversity approach, or a policy which is framed in terms of celebrating diversity, says that we recognise that within our geographical area, within our remit, within the possible people we might work with, within society generally, there are a whole range of different people with different identities, different needs, different ways of being, and so on. And we recognise those differences, and we think those differences are kind of part of what makes our society rich and encompassing. And that notion of celebrating the difference, celebrating the diversity within the society, within the community that we're working within, is an approach which, again, in this case, then recognises difference. So it goes slightly further than saying we welcome everyone. And it particularly says that we recognise that people are different to each other for whatever reason, and that we celebrate that difference. We recognise that difference is part of what makes society a rich and fulfilling place to be. So that notion of celebrating diversity, recognising difference, and acknowledging the way that different communities, different identities make up the society that we're part of. That's the second approach, the celebrating diversity approach. The third approach I want to talk a little bit about is one that recognises there are barriers to inclusion. So it starts from a position that, let's say it's a nursery or a school or a college or a youth group or a youth project, and that it recognises that the way that the project or centre or building is structured, or perhaps the culture of the building, or for whatever it might be, it recognises that there may be barriers which prevent everyone from being included. And what the policy does then is says we have a commitment to working towards ensuring inclusion, so we will do everything we can to address those barriers. Now, those barriers might be, for instance, physical barriers. So if a building, for instance, isn't accessible to people who have mobility issues or perhaps use a wheelchair, they will then take measures to make those buildings accessible. But the barriers to inclusion might go way beyond physical barriers. They might be much more social barriers, psychological barriers, cultural barriers, emotional barriers. And in fact, the barriers may be the attitudes that other people have towards people. But a policy which promotes inclusion and recognises barriers and then seeks to address those barriers to ensure that everyone is included is a particular approach which many of the schools, many of the projects, many of the nurseries, many of the youth groups we work with will take. That notion of having a commitment to inclusion, recognising those barriers and then seeking to address those barriers in order to ensure inclusion. So that's the third approach. And the fourth approach then recognises that there are barriers, recognises there are a difference, and says in order for us to work towards a society where there are no barriers and where those differences are not ones which are then perpetuated through discrimination or oppression or so on, it recognises that some groups, because of their disadvantage or because they're being marginalised or excluded in some way, those groups will need additional support. And those groups will need potentially services which focus particularly on those needs and the identities of those people in those groups. So it targets particular services to provide an additional service, additional support for people with that identity or in that context. So briefly, let me take the example of working perhaps with lesbian, gay, transgender young people, children and young people. An inclusion, an open door policy, we would say we welcome everyone. We don't discriminate. We don't exclude people on the bounds based on sexuality or anything. We welcome everyone, and that will be an open door policy. A celebrating diversity approach, the second one I mentioned, will be to acknowledge that there are different people with different identities and to recognise those different identities and celebrate that we do, within our society, have a range of different identities in terms of sexuality and so on. Third approach, the recognising the barriers to inclusion, would say perhaps within this particular project or centre we recognise that, for example, homophobia and homophobic attitudes may well prevent some people from feeling more comfortable in this project or this centre or this school or college, and therefore we will take steps to address that homophobia and to counteract that homophobia in order that people with LGBT identity may feel then more included. And the fourth approach would say we recognise that people from LGBT communities may feel marginalised and disadvantaged and excluded in certain contexts, and we recognise the additional or particular needs that those children and young people may have, and so we're going to provide some additional targeted sort of services which work particularly with those groups. And that would be the fourth approach we would take. So those four approaches: welcome all, celebrating diversity, reducing barriers to inclusion, and providing additional services for disadvantaged, marginalised groups. Those are the four approaches that I'd like to introduce and ask you to think about in terms of your own project, your own centre, in what way that any or all of those approaches might be evident in your work. It may be, for example, that you work in a centre where there is, broadly speaking, an open door policy, but some additional support is put into people with particular needs or particular identities. So think about how those identities, those needs are recognised, and to what extent any barriers to inclusion are addressed. So just to round off then, I want us to think about when we're talking about or exploring issues of equality, diversity, inclusion, do we then see the issue as one of treating everyone the same and not treating them differently? Do we have an approach where we say we treat everyone the same, we don't treat anyone differently? Or do we say we treat everyone differently and we don't treat anyone the same? So have a think about which of those and in what circumstances those two, perhaps almost polar opposite approaches are evident in your practice or that of your workplace. It's about treating everyone the same and not treating anyone differently, or it's about treating everyone differently and not treating them the same. So think about those two opposites, if you like. And the very final thing then will just be to leave you with a piece of an idea, concept which I'd like you to think about and explore, and it's the notion of praxis, Praxis. Praxis is to do with the way that we have a commitment to practice that's informed by theory, but is driven by a desire or commitment to social justice. That we recognise the need for our work to be about about promoting social justice and equality, and therefore our work has that value as an underpinning maxim or an underpinning principle. It's the notion of praxis. Have a look at the other material I've placed on Student Central, which gives you some examples of policies and the way that they might reflect different ideas, different policy, different approaches to equality, and think about how those ideas of equality, inclusion and diversity are reflected in your practice and that of your centre. And I look forward to seeing you on the next Saturday that we're together.